to the cerebellum. So here's the cerebellum, also, which means little brain. So it's inferior and posterior. It's really inferior to the cerebrum. It's posterior to the medulla and the pons, and regulates posture and balance. It smooths and coordinates skeletal muscle movements. Connected to the brainstem by the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles, as I mentioned a little bit ago, which are different from the cerebral peduncles, which go to the cerebrum. So there are two hemispheres, just like in the brain. You have the left and right cerebellar hemispheres. And what connects the two hemispheres is a structure, it's called the vermis. And then you'll see the gyri in the bumps in the cerebellum are called folia, which means leaves. And the cerebellar cortex is gray matter, and the interior part is white matter called arbor vitae. And we'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Next slide. So here is a superior view of the cerebellum. So you have the, so it'll be left, this will be right, cerebellar, cerebellar hemisphere, and this would be the left cerebellar hemisphere. That's an A. I've actually it's already on the slide, sorry. The vermis is the central part in the middle here because it supposedly looks like a worm. So that's what they use the Latin word for worm. Folia means leaves. So each of these thin little sections here, this is one here, like that. So that is a leaf. So those are the folia. Each one is a folium. Next slide. Okay, so cerebellum, so this is a mid-sagittal section through the brainstem and the cerebellum. And so we see a cerebellar peduncle here. And we also see white matter. So you can see that very clearly. And it's called arbor vitae. And that's because it looks like a tree. So it's the tree of life is what that refers to. And then you have the cerebellar cortex. Cortex is on the outside. So the cortical region is always on the outside. Cortex meaning bark in Latin. And that's the gray matter. So you have gray matter and you have white matter. So you've heard about gray matter and white matter in the brain. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that in a little bit. But they also have gray matter and white matter in the cerebellum. So let's see. And this just to give you the all your landmarks. So you have the pons, you have mammillary bodies, you have the superior and inferior colliculus there, here, and here. So here's your cerebellum here in cross section. There. And this little area right here is called the fourth ventricle. And then here's your medulla oblongata down here. So, okay. All right, next slide. Here's just an enlarged version of it, just so you can see the arbor vitae and the cerebellar cortex, the gray matter on the outside of it. So it's very easy to see. And so I think we described it last time, but why is it gray matter and white matter? Remember we talked about in the nervous system introduction, talked about gray matter is due to cell bodies and white matter is due to lipid. It's the axons have myelin all around them. So if you have this gyrus, like that, and you have cell bodies, because cell bodies are big, so they make this fat area out here, this large area, swelled area out here, and the axons coming off all these guys are skinny, so they don't need a whole lot of room. So that's why you get all these tracks and then they come together like that. So you can see from this diagram, you can visualize that there are those each of the cell bodies are in the outside cortex, and then the tracks of fibers go down through the middle there. So that gives you your white and gray matter. Okay, next slide. This is a little complicated slide. I'm not sure I want to spend a lot of time on it. I won't. Sorry. Just on the bottom left section, I just wanted to show you there's a superior inferior and middle peduncles coming from the cerebellum. That's what this is. So here's your superior one is here. The inferior one, there's a little bit of it here, and there's a little bit of it down here, and then the middle peduncle. So it's showing the peduncle is tracts of white fibers that gather and they come together, and then they go into this, it's like the cerebellum always looks like, cauliflower or, broccoli to me. And so you have this, flowery structure that comes down into a stalk. And so that's the peduncle is a stalk. Peduncle is also used in botany to refer to a stalk-like structure that has something that connects to another structure. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go up to the diencephalon. We've done the cerebrum, we've done the cerebellum, and we've done the brainstem. So now we're going to do the diencephalon. So what is diencephalon? It's superior to the brainstem. It's in the middle of the brain, and it's this whole region right around here. So there's your diencephalon region there. Okay, next slide. Here's a diagram of it, and what you have a region called the thalamus. It's here. Then you have the epithalamus, which is here. And you have the hypothalamus, which is here. Okay? And let's see. Yeah. So the thalamus is like this egg-shaped structure. It's roundish. It's swollen out on the sides, and it's like a little egg. And there's two of them. Everything almost everything in the brain is paired. The only thing that's not paired is the pineal gland, which is on the back. And I think it was Descartes, who decided that was the location of the soul, because that was the only unpaired structure in the whole brain. So a little side story for you. Okay, so the thalamus is an egg-shaped structure. The epithalamus is on the back side, the posterior side of the diencephalon, and is so epi kind of meaning above. In reference to the hypothalamus, is sort of above or outside of the thalamus. The hypothalamus means down below or inferior to the thalamus. So that's your hypothalamus down there. So hypothalamus is here. Hypothalamus. And this is your epithalamus. And here's your thalamus. Okay. Epithalamus has the pineal gland. And the hypothalamus has the pituitary gland. And that's what, there it is. You can see it pointing to it. Okay, next slide. Here's an enlarged view of the diagram along with the dissected cadaver brain here, showing the thalamus here. And you have pineal gland sticking off the back here. And you have the hypothalamus here. And you also have the mammillary, this is a mammillary body, so this actually goes with the midbrain there. There's your mammillary body there. So, and the pineal, and the stalk here going down to what should be the pituitary gland hanging down here. And the stalk, so the stalk, just for a fun word, that stalk is called the infundibulum. So the infundibulum is a little stalk off of which the pituitary gland hangs. So that gives you your thalamus. Hypothalamus is anterior, and epithalamus is posterior. Has the pineal gland, and the hypothalamus has the pituitary. So there they are. There's your diencephalon. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about what the thalamus is. So you have these egg-shaped bodies. They're about 80% of the mass of shape or the area, I guess, of the diencephalon. You have one in each hemisphere of the brain, or each hemisphere of the brain contains one of these bodies. There's a little piece called the intermediate mass, which I forgot to point out to you. It's a small round bridge that goes that connects the two sides. So you have these two eggs here. You have the brain around the outside. There's two little eggs in the middle, and there's a little tiny bridge that connects them. It's called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. Not everybody has an intermediate mass, but most times you do. It's referred to often as the grand central relay station. It is the primary relay station for sensory fibers and for some motor fibers going out. But for a lot of sensory information coming in, it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus then decides in quotes, where that sensory information is going to go to in the cerebrum. So that all of that, the information is coming in from your fingers and your all over your body is coming in and going to there, and then it distributes it to the parts of your brain that are going to make decisions about what you're going to do with that information. Okay, so it's a thalamus is a large body, so things there's cell bodies in there. So you have synapse, and those are relayed to particular areas of the cerebral cortex to be interpreted, and other fibers then relay signals out to the somatic motor cortex. Let's see. And also the interesting part about the thalamus is it also filters unnecessary sensory information. So you're involved in consciousness, emotions, learning, and memory, and so you have this a relay station. But also, let's say you get a little something brushes your hand, and you may not notice it. And why didn't you notice it? Well, it could be because either the nerves didn't get triggered far enough to send a signal up there, or if they did, your thalamus may just go, it's not a big deal. I'm not gonna bother the big important brain up here with trivial information. I'm just gonna filter that out. So that's the other part of what the thalamus does. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked about the hypothalamus a little bit, and it's below the thalamus. Hypo, below, is quadrangular shaped. So it's this kind of shape, it's a shape more like this. So it's a quadrangle. It goes down like that. And so it has the infundibulum hanging down with the pituitary gland hanging off of that. Also, there's mammillary bodies just below that. They're relay stations for smell and taste. Let's see. And the hypothalamus has groups of nerve cells that control homeostasis. They integrate and control the pituitary gland and hormonal functions. And we're going to talk about the endocrine system like the last class of this whole thing, of the lab. Let's see. It helps control hormonal functions, autonomic functions, emotions, behavior, body temperature, eating, drinking, hunger and thirst. Pituitary gland is involved in lots and lots of different things, and so the hypothalamus is involved in lots and lots of things. The epithalamus is superior and posterior to the thalamus, and it's posterior, at least to the thalamus. It's somewhat superior to the hypothalamus, at least, and it includes the pineal gland. Secretes melatonin, so that's supposed to help you go to sleep. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we did the 4 brain regions. So the cerebrum, so the outside part of the brain, the brain stem, with midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. We did the cerebellum, and then we ended up with the diencephalon, which has the thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, and the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. Okay, next slide. So this is just a cadaver, mid-sagittal section of cadaver brain showing the what we've gone over. So cerebrum, and then brain stem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, then the cerebellum there, and then the diencephalon here. Diencephalon section here. Number 4. So showing the thalamus, and actually, I did want to point this out. This is the right there. Oops, went over it a little too far, sorry. So that is the intermediate mass of the thalamus right there. Intermediate mass of the thalamus. Right there, that little roundish part there. And okay, so we've gone with the major regions of the brain. Let's move on. Next slide. Okay, in this diagram, I forgot about this diagram. There's I did plot a diagram showing the intermediate mass of the thalamus, and I'll tell you why that's somewhat important later on. It's just a kind of a landmark you'll see with the ventricles. Okay, next slide. So, well, just point out everything just one more time. So here's the thalamus, the intermediate mass of the thalamus. We have the epithalamus back here with the pineal gland. We have the hypothalamus, really here, and the pituitary gland here. This is the optic nerve coming off here, referred to as optic chiasm because it crosses over. And you also have a mammillary body as well. Okay, next slide. This is a frontal section of a diagram of the brain. And so we talked about the corpus callosum, and that's what this section is right here. That's the corpus callosum. And what I wanted to talk about, and this is these egg-shaped bodies here. That's a thalamus, and here's another thalamus here. So, but what I really want to talk about is the cerebral cortex. There, we're going to show a couple pictures of that. We'll see what that looks like. So this is the gray matter, and this is the white matter. Okay, and yeah, we'll get into this all this stuff a little bit later. So that, and there's another major feature is a longitudinal fissure going right down the center of the brain, dividing it into left and right hemispheres. Okay, so gray matter and white matter. Next slide. Here's the inferior aspect of the brain, just to get our bearings again. So we have the this is just showing half of the cranial nerves, and we have and showing from the inferior aspect, we have the pituitary gland, where it would be the mammillary bodies where they are, so they're paired bumps there. Midbrain, we have the cerebral peduncles there. Oops. Cerebral peduncles here and there. The pons is here. And then that's a little too wide also. Sorry about that. Try it again. So the pons there. And we have the cerebellar peduncles leading into the pons there and there. And then all the yellow stuff are all, those are all cranial nerves. And then we have the medulla oblongata hanging down here. And this is the olivary nucleus there. And this is a pyramidal tracts. And then there'd be a decussation going across in here. So next slide. Okay. So cerebrum, what does it do and how is it structured? Well, we talked about right and left cerebral hemispheres, and they are superior to and surrounding the diencephalon, and surrounds part of the brainstem as well, and is over the top of the cerebellum. It's the center of higher mental processes, intelligence, communication, learning, memory, reasoning, emotions. You get sensory input coming in, and you initiate skeletal muscle contractions going back out of it. Three major regions are the cerebral cortex. So cortex meaning bark is the gray matter. Cell nuclei are in the gray matter, just like we talked about for the cerebellum. And white matter are the axon fibers. So the basal nuclei, a ganglion is a knot. So they're sometimes called, usually called ganglion outside the central nervous system, and called nuclei within the central nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, you'll have ganglion. So those basal ganglia are cell nuclei, neuron nuclei, groups of them that are deep in the brain. So it'll be a cluster of cell nuclei that's deep down in the brain. So you have the cerebrum, and then these little body. You'll have the thalamus, which is the relay station for sensory, mostly for sensory fibers, and then you have these little knots down below that are the basal nuclei. And I'll show you some pictures of those here in a second. So next slide. The gray matter is superficial, has nerve cell bodies and dendrites, integrating sensory information. The white matter is deep to the outer cortex. So we have the gray matter. The white matter is deep to the outer cortex, has myelinated axons, and there are three kinds of fiber tracts: association, commissural, and projection fibers. Association fibers transmit nerve impulses within the same hemisphere. So you have two hemispheres of the brain, and so you have fibers that go back and forth between the different sections of the brain. Those are called association fibers. Commissural fibers go back and forth between the two hemispheres. Okay, so they go back and forth. So the commissural fibers, the corpus callosum is a large tract of commissural fibers. Then you have the two halves of the brain, and the corpus callosum actually holds together the two halves of the brain. Projection fibers are ascending and descending tracts, so those go up and down. So those go from the body all the way back up and up to the brain, then go back down out of the brain. So they project nerve impulses from inferior to superior brain areas and from superior to inferior brain areas. They also link the cerebral cortex with the diencephalon brainstem, cerebellum, and spinal cord. So those projection fibers they project down or they project back up into the brain. The visible examples, you can see the fornix. Those are association fibers. Look sort of like commissural fibers, but they aren't. And the corpus callosum, which is the most prominent commissural fiber tract. So commissural is between the two hemispheres. Association, think about association, you're associating with other people. So the association means like in this side of the brain, you guys are associating with each other. On the right side of the brain, they're associating with each other. So they're sending signals back and forth. So those are association fibers on either side. The commissural, you're commiserating, you're talking with people. So you got these two groups of people and they're commiserating because everything's bad or everything, usually you commiserate because everything's bad. So they're commiserating, so their commissural fibers are talking back and forth this way. So projection, you're projecting all of your anxieties or your instructions or whatever down to the body, and your body's sending projecting information back up to you. So that's the projection fibers going up and down. Hope that helps. Okay, next slide. So here's gray matter and white matter in the cerebrum. So you see the gray matter here and the white matter here. So you can see, and just like I drew with the cerebellum, let's see, you have your gyrus here, and gyrus here, and gyrus here. So you have cell bodies all jam-packed in here, and cell bodies in here, and cell bodies in here, and they project out fibers that all come together. Okay? So this is a frontal or coronal section. So you've taken the brain, if you look at the brain here, and you've done a section down through the brain, then you turn the brain as it shows here. You turn the brain and then you do a section and then you turn it, and so you're looking at it front on that way. So here's your corpus callosum here. So this is commissural fibers going back and forth across there. So it's letting the left and right halves of the brain talk to each other. Then you also have, there's a couple other things to point out here. This is a basal nucleus, and this is another basal nucleus here, and you got the same thing over here. So you have a basal nucleus here and a basal nucleus here, and you'll notice that these are kind of striped here. You have stripes of gray matter going across white matter, and that's striations is what, so stripes, striations is another word for striping. And so that striations, that part is called the striatum, is that stripes of gray matter going across the white matter. So those two regions, number 5 and number 7 here, you have the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Those are two nuclei of nerve cell bodies deep within the brain. So you have the cerebral cortex so that would be cerebral cortex here. and putamen is nucleus. And so these are nuclei within the brain. So they're deep to the more superficial cortex and more superficial white fibers. Okay, and you can also see in the frontal section, you can see partway into the temporal lobe, so you're starting to see a little bit of insula right there. So that's kind of what it looks like in frontal section. So, okay, next slide. And you can also see gray matter and white matter on an MRI. I thought it'd be interesting for the radiology people to see. You can see gray matter and white matter, and so this is a sagittal section, frontal, coronal section here and here. So showing white matter tracks. Okay, next slide. Well, let me point out. So you can clearly see the cerebrum here. You can clearly see corpus callosum there, and you can see the cerebellum easily here, and you can see a cerebellar peduncle right there, and the brainstem coming up in the diencephalon all the way up into there, and the spinal cord there. So you can see all these different regions of the brain in the sagittal section in an MRI very easily. And you can see the corpus callosum here in the frontal section there, as well as the gray matter and white matter tracks. The gray matter cortex and the white matter tracks. Okay, next slide. So here's the corpus callosum. Here's what it looks like in a mid-sagittal section. So there's the corpus callosum all the way around here. Okay, this is called the fornix. This little arched here. So the C-shaped corpus callosum. So that should help you see. It's C-shaped. So corpus callosum both start with C. Fornix. So corpus callosum is the commensal fibers. So those are commensal fibers. And the fornix is just above the thalamus, which is here. And you have the pineal gland back there, and the hypothalamus here, mammillary body here. So there's your diencephalon region. But that's showing you the corpus callosum, and the fornix those are actually association fibers. They actually don't go across between hemispheres. Those fibers stay in the same hemisphere. So those are just back and forth. The corpus callosum goes side to side. They commiserate. Next slide. Here's this is a diagram showing the commensal fibers in the corpus callosum here. As you can see that they go back and forth. They go side to side. Projection fibers, those are going up and down on both sides. And you also notice this decussation here. So were they crossing over? They decussate there. So those fibers, the projection fibers cross over. Remember that I showed you the decussation in the medulla oblongata. So and then association fibers over here. So you can see those go. Here's association fibers here going, just staying. These are going back and forth. Going back and forth between two different gyri. So you have association fibers going like this. Okay. And then also the structure in the middle. I'll start pointing this out now. We're going to get into this later. There's a lateral ventricle and a third ventricle. So this funky kind of shaped structure here. Those are lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. And I'll talk about what that is later on. Next slide. Here's that diagram again showing the corpus callosum, which is white matter. Those are fibers, and then the cerebral white matter and the cerebral gray matter, cerebral cortex. And here are the basal nuclei. There's a caudate nucleus, which is deep, which is here. They have the putamen, which is here, and the globus pallidus here. So you have those different basal nuclei. I'm going to show you a picture of what those look like later on. So, but for now, let's just concentrate on gray and white matter. So we have the fornix, white matter, and we have the corpus callosum over here. The label over here. So the fornix, looking at it from the front side, is kind of this is this. region there, and then the corpus callosum is region up here. So, all right, next slide. So this is showing the corpus callosum one more time. Going across here. And so you get gray matter, white matter, corpus callosum, which are commissural fibers, fornix, association fibers, here, here. And then, let's see, anything else I want to show. So here's your third ventricle. Here's lateral ventricles. So there's holes in your brain. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay, so here's what the basal nuclei look like, not in cross-section, but in actual kind of 3D project, drawing, sort of 3D kind of view. And you have two of them. There's two sets on each side. So you have the globus pallidus, and you have the striatum, which is the caudate nucleus, and the putamen. So you don't have to know those. I just want you to know that not all of the processing takes place in the gray matter and the cortex. There are also deep nuclei within the brain that also do more processing as well. So you have cortex, white matter, some nuclei deep, and then you have the diencephalon, the brain stem coming down, and the cerebellum in back. So you have these different regions that are going on, doing different things in your brain. So the brain is actually it's pretty darn complicated. I admit, I don't throw a lot of terms at you, but I think you'll be able to. I think you'll get it. So if you have any questions, give me a shout. So all right, next slide.